Genghis Khan. I told you to mention him later. Your book finally goes into some detail about him. He's been mentioned several times already. And I hope I spell that name the way your book does. G-E-N-G-A, okay, yeah, G-H-I-S. Essentially, of all the world's great conquerors, Genghis Khan is the only one who started out truly in poverty. He was the son of a lesser nobleman, but his father was poisoned one day. I read a biography about it when I was in the 6th grade, and then turned around when I was in graduate school, and my professors required us to do outside reading, so I checked out the same book, and I was told it was a famous classic, written in the 1930s or so. But anyway, described how that when they realized, the people of the tribe realized, hey, we're going to be led by a 10-year-old boy, all the male members of the tribe deserted, and Genghis Khan was left to lead a few women who stayed loyal. But he grew up, spending about 10 years leading around these women, and he joined himself to another tribe with himself as the head, and somehow he managed that, and then joined another tribe. Then they conquered a few other tribes, and he finally did something that hadn't been done in hundreds of years. He was able to conquer all of Mongolia and rule all of Mongolia, largely because he had a military sensibility about him that a lot of people didn't have. Maybe it helped that he grew up in poverty, but he fought from mounted cavalry, but he had his cavalry organize themselves in squads of 10. And they were so strict about it that any man who got lost in a squad of 10 could expect to be killed when the battle was over. You had to know where your squad members were all the time and where the squad leader was. And no enemy could fight one of you. If an enemy engaged in one of you, all 10 members of the squad were going to come after you. And it was a type of organization that somehow Islam never achieved, and it was one reason perhaps why he was able to use Islam's own tactics against them, because he was organized more than they. But anyway, he conquered Mongolia. Then his people began to urge him, hey, look, we know something you might not have heard. China is weak. Well, Genghis Khan, I mean, with all due respect, he hesitated, because he knew that China had millions of people. Nevertheless, he was finally persuaded, yeah, we can do it. So he went to the Great Wall of China. The Chinese were terrified, so they began to put the army there at the Great Wall, ready for him. But he began marching his army up and down the wall, up and down. And after a while, the Chinese got tired of marching with him, so he finally noticed that, hey, the army just didn't show up today, only a few troops there, so he just got his 100,000 men, and they began to ram hard against the gate of the wall, broke the gate, and they were inside. Now, folks, there have been many, many a time in history where barbarians have conquered civilized people. And a lot of times the issue is the civilized people don't have the numbers. But this is one instance where the Chinese outnumbered the Mongolians, whom I'll call barbarians for the time being, outnumbered them by more than 10 to 1. How did he do it? The Chinese were under the Song dynasty, and the Song dynasty did not seem to care about military spending or building up an army. The Chinese, once they realized these invaders were inside, well, China has been overrun several times by barbarians. Later, the Manchu were to come in, and they were only semi-civilized people. And during the Dark Ages, several barbarian tribes would come in and take over. China has been overrun by outside invaders several times, and a lot of them were people what we might call barbaric invaders. And a lot of it was simply because the Chinese did not have the will to stand up for themselves and fight. I mean, folks, as ugly as it sounds, as terrible as, I mean, when I was a young man, I didn't want to join either. And I wound up, when I was 30, joining the Army for a while. I've only seen combat in my dreams. I've had several dreams of being in war. But, and as terrible as it is, it's something that's necessary, because if you don't stand up for yourself, people will come in and take everything you have, including your life if they decide it's necessary. They'll come in, they'll enslave you. Slavery, it can't happen in the 21st century. Folk don't believe it. Genghis Khan put the emperor to terror. The chief general poisoned himself, committed suicide because he realized he couldn't collect an army. The Chinese just ran from Genghis Khan and his hordes like crazy. And in short order, Genghis Khan had conquered China, the land that had millions more people than he had. Now, I've already mentioned how the Genghis Khan then went across these mountains here and the deserts and overran the Muslim world and would have destroyed Islam permanently, except a lot of his people adopted Islam. He went here into what is today Russia and conquered Russia, and the Mongolians were to hold Russia for the 200 years afterward. This is something I do want to remember because we'll talk about it when we come to medieval Europe. Russia served as a buffer, though, to keep them out of Europe. Now, a Mongolian army did engage a Polish army. The Mongolian army won. But Genghis Khan died, and the Mongolian army was called back home to make this really, really, really long trip back home. And this saved Europe. If Genghis Khan could have lived 150 years, who knows what he might have done, because nobody could stand up to him. Nobody was prepared to. And European monarchs realized we don't have the means to stand up to him, but they were glad that they had a big buffer. The Arab world and Russia were the big buffers that kept the Muslim world at bay and gave Europe a chance to somewhat go. Now, to somewhat, you might say, develop. Yeah, recover is not the word, but gave Europe a chance to develop. Now, as these Mongolians marched westward, unknown to them, they were being followed by a certain species of rat that carried a flea. And this rat was to bring the Black Death to the Muslim world, to Europe, and to China, and carry off vast numbers of the population. Somehow the Mongolians seem to have been semi-immune to it. I mean, you develop immunity if you've been exposed to a germ long enough. At least with some germs you develop an immunity to. What's that? Yeah.
So you said that they brought the Black Death to where?
To Europe. They brought the Black Death to China, the Middle East, and to Europe. It hit Europeans the hardest, and probably the reason for that was Europeans would have had the least resistance to this pest, this blight that carried off that carried the disease. The disease was carried by ticks who feasted on rats, and it only feasted on one kind of rat. Now, I think it was the black rat. And then the brown rat eventually came in and destroyed the black rat. Now, I hope I've got my color. The colors were brown and black. But anyway, the brown rat came in following Genghis Khan's army westward. And they carried a plague. But eventually another kind of rat came in, destroyed the rat that carried the plague. You know, when it did, the fleas get on this other kind of rat. Now, folk, if you study parasitology, and I did, a lot of times these pests will infect one species and not even infect a member of the same genus. I mean, same genus but different species. That's how sometimes how particular they are. The one rat did not, the pest did not affect it. The other rat, anyway, he carried the Black Death with him. I'm going to have more to say about the Black Death when I come to chapter 13. I'll say this now, it's kind of interesting. When the Black Death hit Europe, two types of people seemed to not get it. And these type of people became very hated. They were Jews and old maids. Anybody wonder, why my old maids have been largely free from the plague? What do old maids have around their house that typically, anybody know?
Old maids.
Old maids. In other words, women who never married. What do they typically have around their house? Cats. Yeah, cats. And the cats, well, what good did the cats do? And the cats kept the rats away. As for the Jews, maybe Jews like cats also, but in the case of Jews, it's believed that what kept them immune was their emphasis on cleanliness. Any of you ever read Moses? Moses had a lot to say about clean, clean, and more clean, and keeping clean. And anyway, what happened was the old maids were looked on as being witches and hated, and because they didn't get the disease. And the Jews were looked on as being witches also, or wizards, and they were hated. So it led to Europeans rising up to kill off both groups, especially the Jews. Anyway, your book goes on to talk about how quite a killer Genghis Khan was, and I've mentioned this. Actually, your book mentions his army in 1227 probably totaled less than 130,000 men. I really believe, now, I mean, so you can argue, I had a student argue that I really believe if the Chinese would have had a really good standing army, they could have stopped him. If they had another dynasty other than the Song in power, they could have stopped him. After all, they outnumbered him more than 10-1. Genghis Khan was not immortal, he was not invincible, he was human like the rest of us. But they wouldn't stand up for themselves. Yes?
Okay, so Genghis Khan conquered the Song dynasty, not his army.
He conquered the Song dynasty, yes, and he scored it and set up his own dynasty called the Yuan, Y-U-A-N dynasty.
Okay, because it says in the book on page 283 under his picture,
Yeah.
founder of the Mongol Empire,
Right.
and then it said died long before Mongol warriors defeated the armies of the Song.
You know what, they might not have finished the job. They started the job. I mean, he came into China, they started the job. Now I might stand correct, his armies might not have been, in fact, really, his sons never ruled China, but his grandson, Kublai Khan, did have China. And they started a new dynasty called the Yuan. Okay. But the Mongolians definitely conquered China. If he didn't himself, he got the ball rolling. And then his grandson, Kublai Khan. Now, anybody know, why do you remember Kublai Khan? Kublai Khan why is he important to Westerners? I mean, he had a really big influence on us even here. Yes? He was the emperor when Marco Polo visited. We finally have a documented case where a European family made the long, long trip all the way to the Chinese capital and visited the court of the Chinese emperor. And the Chinese emperor was so impressed that he made him an officer in his court. Kublai Khan, most powerful ruler probably on earth at the time. Now he's important to us because when Marco Polo came home, he wrote a book. Christopher Columbus got a hold of the book, and it influenced Columbus to discover America. Columbus said, hey, I believe we can get to China by boat, by sailing west, because after all, the earth is round. He didn't realize that there were two big continents. In principle, he was right. But there were two big continents in a way. But anyway, that's where he influenced us. Marco Polo has a lot to do with the discovery of America. Marco Polo in the 1300s, Columbus in the late 1400s.